Hi. I want to thank all of you for showing up on a Tuesday night. I realize that's a change in your schedules, and it's awfully kind of you to be able to make that departure from your normal routine to join Steve Izenour and see some of the slides that he brought and listen to them. I think you're going to have a good time. Steve is Senior Associate with Venturi, Scott Brown and Associates. He's been with the firm 127 years. It's longer than I thought. Time just flies. So, if you consider the fact that Bob Venturi and Denise Scott Brown and their associates like Steve have been producing architecture and urban design that's been recognized by critics around the world as some of the finest and most influential, and they've been considered some of the finest and most influential architects in this century, and that includes some folks who are even dead, I think that's quite an accomplishment. It says here in Steve's resume that some of you may have read this because I posted it, and I apologize for those of you. I'm just going to read a couple of lines here. It says it earned a substantial reputation for combining outstanding design ability, that's Steve Izenour I'm talking about, and expertise in communication technologies with special sensitivity to their use in environmental and historical contexts. These skills have been an important component of Venturi Scott Brown Associates' award-winning planning projects and the development of design guidelines for historic districts in small towns and inner city neighborhoods. Steve is the author of 2 books, has led several major design research projects, lectured all around the world at universities. Design of his parents' home was exhibited in the Pompidou Center in Paris and won a National AIA Award. He was educated at Yale, where he received his Master's in Environmental Design, that's MED, and the University of Pennsylvania, and did his undergraduate work at Swarthmore College, and won a National Honor Award for the design of House on Long Island Sound, and received a Fulbright Fellowship, and John Stewartson Traveling Fellowship, and the Duffy. What is this? Where'd you go on this fellowship? 1964, Doffinger McMahon Traveling Fellowship. Where'd you go? Camden? Europe? London? Where'd you go? Oh, came to Muncie on that one. He's been a design critic at the University of Pennsylvania since 1972. He's lectured at a string of universities. Ball State seems to be the most outstanding place he's lectured from some of these, from this list, although there's some others that I've heard of on the list. And his research, including learning from Las Vegas, learning from Levittown, signs of life, symbols in American City. I remember when that was at the Renwick, Beach, Boardwalk, and Boulevard. A lot of these you might be familiar with from your own readings. I know I am. And then he authored that book with Paul Hirschhorn, White Towers, which I have upstairs, autographed by the author here, Steve Izenour. And all I could say is he's come here from Seattle, from a project in Seattle that he's going to talk about, on his way to Columbus, Indiana, where Bob Venturi and Denise Scott Brown will meet him when they make a presentation with a multidisciplinary group on the Gateways to Columbus project. And when Steve came out originally to Columbus to work on that project, he asked for some Ball State students that might be able to help work on it with him. So Cato Smith, who's sitting right next to him, went down there to help, and our recent graduate Michael Sassa was down there to help, and I think they represented us very well. So I think those are the important things I wanted to share with the audience. The bicycle pants, because he's an avid bicycle enthusiast, but broke his ankle this fall for the walks with a slight limp. And the last thing which I'd like to tell you, and then I won't waste any more of your time, Steve is probably the only person we've had hundreds of people come and lecture here over the years. This is really an amazing fact. It's just amazing. And for all of you in the front here will look back up in the balcony, those of you in the balcony will look at the projector. Steve is the only person who's ever come here to lecture who's built his own slide projector. That's just amazing in itself. And he'd build one for you too if you have the right price. Now, I want to say that it's just great to have him come back here, and anytime he wants to come back, he's more than welcome. He's a little tired because he had very little sleep, and so we deducted $20 from his honorarium, and then we added it on when we found out he built his own slide projector. It's great to have you back here, Steve.
Can't compete with that invention. But it is true, I am a little tired, so this will either be very good or very bad, depending on. So why don't we just kill the lights and start the slides right away. What I thought I'd do tonight, whatever, is kind of very briefly hit on some of the kind of theoretical ideas and investigations we've done as a group over the last 25, 30 years, and then kind of juxtapose those to some of our buildings that might or might not correspond to them. And I thought this is kind of interesting for all of you because, I mean, certainly the last dozen years, the architectural world has been rife with competing theories of architecture, a few of which are up here on this schedule. And I mean, there's been kind of an atmosphere of everybody, which in a sense, I guess you could blame Bob Venturi for when he, kind of started in a sense when he wrote Complexity and Contradiction, of kind of competing theoretical positions, each one trying to get a little more extreme and a little bit, kind of define the product by words rather than necessarily by built buildings. And really a lot of ideas that, are perhaps maybe irrelevant to architecture or at least not very aptly applied sometimes. So we're kind of dealing with an environment where ideas seem to be more important than buildings. And I guess that's something that we feel kind of sad about because even though some of us have done kind of research and written books over the years, that was always kind of perceived as a secondary function, kind of a function of poverty, if you will. If you don't have enough work, you can have time to teach, one, and two, write books. And therefore, I guess maybe we're all ready to get back into book writing again, even though the way the work's going these days. But at any rate, we put this little schedule together last year to kind of, and obviously this is very subjective and it's totally, our point of view, so it's very suspect. But it's kind of looking at the whole idea of, the orthodox modernism that we were all taught in school. I mean, graybeard Marvin, my age, kind of late modern, Richard Meyer, that sort of thing. Whatever it is we do in the middle there. Postmodernism, which we don't think we do, so that gets a separate category. And then decon, obviously, which I guess is kind of passe now, so maybe we're out of date already with this thing. Maybe there's something else that ought to be on here that I don't know about yet. And then kind of just looking at the idea of symbol, context, ornament, and form, which are kind of classic ways of that most architectural theories deal either positively or negatively with those themes. And obviously we get all the big black dots because we do everything, right? And everybody else gets a lot of little dots and a few big dots here and there. But all this is trying to point out, I mean, again, I don't put it up as a victim of anything. It's just pointing out the fact that so much of recent theory in the last 50, 60 years has tended to, rather than trying to integrate things and, quote, do more, basically tries to do less, at least from our perspective. It tries to define what is an architecture in a rather narrow sort of way. So that what they do, I guess that's good Madison Avenue policy, right? Define the product, figure out, that everybody else is bad and you're good, and therefore you have a better sell. And that's kind of what's happened in the theoretical environment, I have a feeling, that we've kind of over-defined what is and isn't architecture. Whereas, the attempt in Complexity and Contradiction and things like Learning from Las Vegas and Learning from Levittown, which was never published, was more to be much more inclusive. It was trying to say architecture can be all kinds of things, in certain situations, in certain contexts. It wasn't trying to exclude very much. It was trying to be highly inclusive. And that, in a general way, is probably the one kind of philosophical, or it isn't even as much philosophical as just kind of an attitude about design and the environment that kind of dominates most of what we do. The idea of theories in architecture, and I leave it to you when we kind of brush by some of these theories and talk about some of the buildings, to kind of make the judgment in your own terms of how relevant those theories, any of those ideas might be for you. Because no theory for anybody is any better than your ability to, put something on paper, to get an idea down, to see something in a way that helps you in some way to solve the problem that you're dealing with. Beyond that, who gives a damn about theories? Nobody pays you for theories. They're paying you for buildings. So in a very real sense, I think, you have to argue, at least out of the academic context, you have to argue that theory is no better than the people that are working with it and what it does to help them do that which people are paying them to do. That's a real pragmatic and rather verging on anti-intellectual attitude towards theory, but I have a feeling it's the honest one that has more to do with what architecture is about. Maybe not what academia is about, but certainly what architecture is about. Next slide. Now, starting with a slide like this, which is kind of a classic image of the American environment. It could be, Muncie, it could be almost 99% of all the towns and cities in America. And what it is kind of a developer's grid just dropped on the landscape, streets and blocks, and the blocks get filled up with buildings, and I suppose we're probably standing on the railroad embankment or something at one end of Main Street. And all the streets disappear into infinity, and it's the classic non-hierarchical American way of dealing with our environment. There's a few exceptions that, disprove this, but this is basically the 18th, 19th, and 20th century American city and town. It can be big, like Philadelphia's grid. It can be small, like this little town. It's an infinitely adaptable form. But the essence of it as a form is its lack of hierarchy. One block's the equal of any other block. One street's the equal of any other street. And therefore, the architecture within it that's developed in this country has always had to be rather highly expressive because it's rather inexpressive. The grid is very inexpressive in terms of location. The comparison to this would be like, a great Baroque city, or Washington, D.C. would be a classic comparison, where the capital is at the end of the great axis, where things are important because of where they are. That's very untrue in most American cities. And therefore, the architecture is typically had to have very direct meanings that are understood by most people because it's the appearance of things that basically tells you how to use this. A house looks like a house, a bank looks like a bank, a school looks like a school. And so there's always been a kind of representational and use of kind of obvious symbolism in American architecture. And that kind of pragmatism that's kind of at the heart of the gridiron is one that's we've always tried to kind of keep at the heart of wherever we go to learn about architecture. Bob wrote about Europe, he wrote about Italian architecture, there's all kinds of things, obviously, that have been important to him over the years, and into developing his architectural language. But he's always grounded those back into an American context. He's never denied the fact that he's an American architect working in the late 20th century. So, so much of this, when people get overly theoretical, is they ignore the very time and place in which they run the risk of ignoring the very time and place in which they work. So, kind of bringing wherever you go, however far afield you go to learn about architecture, it's not a bad thing to ground it back in the reality of the culture in which you're actually working. So an image like this is kind of just kind of symbolic and representational of that culture. Next slide. Here's the classic pieces that fill all that up, right? This happens to be a little town out in near San Francisco, but again, it could be 2 blocks from here, I'm sure, too. I mean, here's City Hall. It's just another building. It's on a corner, and corners are the only hierarchically more important space in a grid, right? Because, you know, the corner gas station, the corner store. And okay, you put City Hall on the corner. But otherwise, it's the same as any other building, except it's made out of brick. It's got some arches, some big steps, and if you miss all of that, you put the word City Hall over the door, and you put an American flag on the corner. So, you know, I mean, it does the job in a very kind of straightforward, representational, symbolic way of letting you know that it's a civic building in this non-hierarchical grid. You know, houses have a certain set of symbols, you know, hip roofs, et cetera, gables, to let you know what they are. The corner store or the corner bar, again, the corner gas station. The high school has some Ionic columns, obviously civic. The bank has some Corinthian columns. So that, you know, basically there's a few locational cues that we all understand at a really young age. You know, as soon as you're allowed to go to the corner store or the 7-Eleven by yourself, that kind of locational imperative of those things are something that you learn at about 6 years old. And it's so basic that you kind of don't think about it. Secondly, the appearance, the physiognomy, the representation of things, super important. And lastly, words. That you know, in something as non-hierarchical spatially as the grid, you constantly have to use words. You can't function without them. You go to a foreign city and you don't know the language, you're immediately aware of the importance of language in terms of architecture and the environment. When Marvin and I were in school at Penn back in the 60s, if we put a word on any drawing we did, much beyond our name, you flunked. Because basically your critics said to you, well, you're just not a very good architect. You've got to use words, and you can't use structure, form, and material to express the essence of the problem. Well, you topped out. You use words. I mean, that's just not architecture. In point of fact, there's all kinds of things, like life and death things, like stop and go, that, you know, you can have the most sophisticated formal representation of stop and go, but the word stop and go is still, you know, people die, you know, if they don't understand yours. So there's all kinds of things when you sell to people, when life, you know, life, limb, and property, and all kinds of things like that, where you're constantly using words, and you have to. So language is a basic part of architecture. That's a pretty old hat idea now. Back in the 60s, when we kind of, you know, wrote about those kind of things, it was really awful because it was the classic cop-out to modernism to kind of admit to the reality of language in the environment. Next slide. Now, we put Dewey a little bit out of order. This is kind of dealing with the idea of residential symbolism. We really looked at Las Vegas and commercial symbolism first, and then looked at Levittown and the whole idea of the kind of the residential environment of America secondly. But it makes a little more sense perhaps tonight to do it the other way around. And each one of these could be a whole lecture or two in itself, and I'll try to make this real kind of shorthand version. And what we did when we looked at an image like this and looked at Levittown was to basically say something that was rather untoward to say when it was said in the late 60s, now is fairly kind of accepted dictum, I think, as a way of dealing with context, or at least learning about context. And it was basically to say, when we went to Las Vegas, in a sense, we were learning to deal with the idea of words and symbol and color and decoration in the larger environment. That we were saying to ourselves, those are important languages or tools that an architect needs when you design in this country in certain situations. When we went to Levittown, quote unquote, we were looking not at, you know, let's learn some skills as architects that are directly, you know, quote, how to design houses, in the same sense that we were kind of doing that in Las Vegas. What we were doing when we went to Levittown was saying, and this was done in the late 60s, in the kind of the heart of the heat of Vietnam and the whole black-white thing that was going down at that point, the whole kind of social structure, struggle of the late 60s, what we were saying is, how can an architect who represents and is a part of a certain taste culture, you're all here learning to be become part of, a guild, as it were, that has a certain set of values, and most of them are implicit. They don't kind of, except for Mark, he probably lays them all out on the blackboard for you. But they're, when you leave here, you're supposed to have a certain set of values as well as some skill. And there's all these implicit values that mean that designers become a kind of little microcosm taste culture of 0.0001% in the larger culture. What we were saying was, and what social scientists were kind of bombarding architects with in the mid and late 60s was, you guys are basically full of shit. You don't know what the hell you're doing. You're going around and tearing down the downtown of Philadelphia and every other city in America. You're building all this stuff, and you say it's for the betterment of society, but you, in point of fact, are being destructive of society because you have no understanding of the values and the social structure and the quote taste cultures, to use Gans' term, of the people that you're doing this for. Because the people you're actually designing it for aren't the people that are using this stuff. And it was probably a pretty valid criticism. I mean, the kind of classic example of it was Jane Jacobs with her famous book that, all the architects when we were in school just hated because she just stuck it to them, and they just got violently, angry that she didn't respect all of their social aspirations. So what we were saying when we did this was, if there's something to this, how does an architect, to this critique, and there probably was and still is, how do we as architects sensitize ourselves to parts of the culture and taste cultures which are not our own? Is that possible? In other words, when you do design, are you giving, does somebody have to do, quote, good design, do you have to, can you accept somebody else's values, even if they aren't your values, and do something of value as designed for those people? Not for yourself, but for somebody else. The jury's out on that. It's a very complex thing we could argue about for a lot of hours. But the kind of position we took at that time was, okay, we're going to try to do that. We're going to try, and we're not trained social scientists, so what we're going to do is we're trained to look at things and kind of see things, which in the social scientist terms is really soft, lousy information, right? Because it's highly subjective. It's what you see and how you interpret it. But that's what we know to do. So, okay, we're going to catalog as many images of how Americans live in a wide range of places as we can, working with a group of students doing all this. And we're going to kind of then look at all this stuff and see what it tells us, what themes, what comes out of that. We're also going to look at the historical development of houses in this country. What does that tell us? What does almost 200 years history at that point of the American house tell you? And to cut to the chase, if you will, on this is, it basically comes down to an image like this. And the idea of the rural ideal in our culture. Anybody who's had any kind of American history or cultural history courses, this is a big theme in any course that's taught about that. That, as a country, we kind of always attributed positive moral, social, aesthetic virtues to an image like this of the one house sitting on 40 acres with the rolling hills, the fields, the wildflowers, the crops, et cetera, et cetera. It's a highly romanticized image, but it's one that is just a constant theme. It's not hard to understand why. I mean, there was all this space when everybody came here. Europe was highly urbanized. That was bad. This was good. It's one that, of course, bedeviled us. It's made it very difficult to deal with cities when we romanticize this and always think of cities as evil. So, there's a kind of basic cultural problem we have with this. But it's a thread that runs through everything, that we attribute, so much value to this image. What we were saying by saying that, again, seems pretty common sense now. We were saying that, but it was a real revelation to us. The idea that an aspiration or a symbolic image, and let's consider this as a symbolic image that represents something in this larger context, can be so powerful and so implicit in a culture that it totally denies the relevance in many cases of the traditional architect's way of thinking that form and function are somehow tied in some logical A plus B equals C way. Because in point of fact, if we say that this image, next slide, is really what this is about, the form and function have nothing to do with each other. This is 4 houses to an acre. That was 1 house to 100 acres or 40 acres. This is the suburbs, as we all know and love it. That's the farm, or hate it, and that's, kind of rural, exurban America. So in the classic Ian McCart or any good modernist, ecologist, etc., definition, these are totally antithetical, point of things. They have nothing to do with each other. One's bad, the other's maybe good. And certainly as a symbol is good. But what we were saying is, look, what's really going on here isn't, most people don't think in the kind of simplistic way about form and function that we were taught to think. They really think in terms of these much greater aspirations about these things. So they don't, so a lot about what this house means to most people is really that last image. And sure, it denies spatial, structural, formal, functional logic on a lot of levels. But that doesn't mean squat. I mean, because what's really important is the power of symbol to deny the reality of, what this thing is, spatially and functionally. I mean, the classic example of that is, why would anybody put up sitting out on a highway for an hour and a half every day to live here, and work some, I mean, there's all kinds of things you put up with in order to have this. Now, sure, there's economic and other social things driving that, but it has to be powerful because, the practical reality would say, the hell with it, I'm not going to do that. There's other ways to solve this, but that hasn't been the case. The case up until very recently, and still is, the reality of that image. So again, this was kind of taking the idea of history, a larger context, the appearance of things, and then trying to get a sense, see what that tells you. Sure, you can't deny the fact that you bring a certain point of view to any investigation, to any design. In doing this kind of thing, it's an exercise in trying to force yourself, one, to define what that point of view is, so you can be explicit about it, so you can guard against kind of applying your own point of view perhaps where it isn't applicable. And developing some techniques to kind of get under the skin of somebody else, to understand where somebody else is coming from. There's lots of tricks to that, which, again, is whole lectures in itself. But the basic idea is kind of going with what you know, learning to see the obvious and catalog the obvious and let the obvious tell you about what it is. Next slide. I mean, here's just an obvious example of that. And because there's really 2 ways. Look, when you come right down to it, people aren't paying you for ideas. They aren't paying you really. They're paying you to sit down at a piece of paper and put something on paper. So they are paying you to make value judgments. You do have to say yes to this and no to that when you sit down and actually draw a line. Anybody does. Otherwise, you're immobilized. You can't function. On the other hand, learning how you learn the vocabulary that you bring to that point can be very open-ended. You don't have to make choices before you draw the line. In fact, the less choices you make, usually the more informed the line becomes, in the sense that the big one, is history, obviously, context, and learning to see the most mundane and ordinary things as being important. And, so here's 2 little houses, typical bungalows. You can find them a block away from here, I'm sure. I mean, it's the classic, housing of the United States before World War II. You sent away your $20 to Sears Roebuck, and you got your plans, and you built your house. And so you find this house, in San Francisco. You can find it here in Muncie. And you pass it every day when you when you grew up as a kid. I mean, and so what you're saying is, gee, but look at this. Look at it as a designer. Gee, they're really rather wonderful. I have no idea who designed them. But look at the scale of this teeny little house, monumentality on the street. Its ability to just say, hey, I'm a neat little house, and somebody really cares about me on this street. The scale of that opening, the kind of abstraction of kind of classic. Kind of green and green, whatever kind of stuff from the early 20th century, very sophisticated. The fact that obviously these are exactly the same house and plan, this little twitch of the roof and the gable, you get 2 different images. That's really, in other words, there's a lot of richness. There's there's a lot of really sophisticated things going down here in something which is a very ordinary object. So that idea of learning to see and learn from the most obvious things around you is probably the most important thing I think we've ever forced ourselves to do that's been the most productive. Next slide. Now we'll just look at a couple of houses. I mean, here's one example of kind of, we've done a half a dozen of these over 25 years. It's your kind of classic late 20th century vacation home, right? It's what's the minimum amount of space that 6 people or, 2 adults and 4 kids or whatever can live in for a week in the summer without killing each other. And so it's basically like designing a boat, right? I mean, it's one big room to live in, to eat and live in, and then you jam in as many beds and whatnot, into this thing as you can. And the assumption is that you really only live here, in good weather pretty much, so you're outdoors most of the time. So it's kind of your minimal little house, 900,000, 800 square feet, whatever it happens to be. And we've built a lot of these all over New England, off and on over the years, this basic program. Next slide. Now, here they are. They're in an environment, because these happen to be on Block Island, and here is the traditional house that was designed for that environment. This is a very cruel environment. In point of fact, the people that lived here all year round a couple hundred years ago, just barely existed. So they built, a tight little Cape Cod fishing shack set down in a swale, and, protected by some windbreaks because you were going to get torn off this thing, 3 times a year. Teeny little windows. It was really man against nature. And they're kind of wonderful the way they kind of integrate that form and the materials into the environment. But here we are in the late 20th century. The client said, gee, I really love these, but boy, I hate to live in them. They're dark, they're wet, they don't have a view. I mean, what the hell, I'm only there in August. I don't care about man against nature. It's 80 degrees, it's great, But, how do you adapt, again, that thing we talked about a minute ago, a form, an appearance of something, it still has associations that are meaningful to people, but the function of it is totally changed. Does that totally change the form? No, not in this case necessarily. It's the same material. It's weathered shingle. It's still a little box, but we've kind of pulled the box vertically so everybody gets light and air. It's still a little 2/2 and whatever windows. So the appearance of things is highly traditional, but their scale has been altered in order to deal with a modern program. And so the idea of this is that that Marv's going to walk out of the door there, and you're not quite sure whether he's got, green Bermudas on or a stovepipe hat is basically the idea of it, that there's a certain ambivalence between, is this really, 1760 or is it really, the late 20th century? And it's the kind of tension between those that the architects have used to create the architecture in a sense. Not totally giving up the one for the other. Next slide. The same in the interior of something like this. I don't know if anybody's ever been in a New England summer house, but basically, if you see this slide, you can smell the mildew, right? Because these things are basically shut up 9 months a year, and they're full of kind of grandma's attic stuff, right? Because you take all the old furniture and you put it into places. And so it's a little bit of this and a little bit of that. And again, it's just this very low-key, quote, almost consciously undesigned thing, but obviously fairly, quote, sophisticatedly undesigned in this case. Next slide. Here's one that, the site for one that I did for my parents about 10 years ago. And again, this is a classic view. I mean, this is your classic New England pier, right? And the reason they look this way is that, New England fishermen were real pragmatic kind of guys. They weren't going to live down here. I mean, they realized that once every 2 years, a big nor'easter like the other day that hit the New England coast, it's going to come roaring through here and tear the holy hell out of it. And so, you go down the shore, you pick up the boards, you nail them back up again, because it's going to get torn apart 2 years later. And you live a mile inland, right? You don't live out here. But in the latter part of the 20th century, we look at a site like this and say, oh, fantastic living opportunity. This is a great site. We're going to build a house out here. And so, that's what we do. This is in a little community called Stony Creek, which is just east of New Haven on Long Island Sound. it's a rather historic site in the sense that this community was famous for its granite, its red granite. Half of New York City came off this pier before it was a fishing pier. In the late 19th, early 20th century, the Brooklyn Bridge pier, the base of the Statue of Liberty, all of the stone literally came off this pier because the quarry was like a mile inland from here. They hauled the stone down, put it on barges, and floated it down to New York. And this is in this kind of piece of Connecticut that's very much, kind of very rural, very rural. It's kind of a little industrial town that in the last few years has been kind of Duffyfied, but a town that my parents had lived in since I was quite young. We lived on an island off this town in the summer. And so they bought this site when they were about 70 years old. Since they had an architect as the son, and it paid for all that education, what the hell, we might as well pay again. Since your parents are about the first people who will ask you to do something, or the only people who will ask you to do something like that. So we took this site and built a house on it, an all-year-round house, kind of their retirement home for 2 people. Next slide. The basic house is very simple, and because of the nature of the site, there's a lot of problems. Basically, it's got to be raised very high in the air because those big storms are just going to flow right through here. So on the ground level, there's nothing but kind of drive-in garages and a stair going up, and big shear walls and big piers kind of going down into the bedrock, so that literally you can lose the whole first floor of the house and it won't fall apart, because once under the pressure of water, you don't try to stop it, you just got to let it go through. So the whole house is basically a one-story house raised up full level in the air. It's kind of drive-in house in the sense that this site in the winter, you don't want to stick your nose out, so you literally drive right into the house and go up and in. And then it's a very simple kind of bungalow plan, living room, dining room, bedroom, TV room. Really minimal, kind of and then an attic that's kind of a guest room or something. So it was a real minimal, tight little house. Next slide. Now, there were some crazy things in this because I designed the exterior of this house. My father's a theater designer and theater engineer, and his hobby his whole life has been tearing houses apart and building. So he was his own contractor. He designed, and he's also an acoustic and opera nut and everything. So he designed all the interiors. I had nothing to do with them. And this living room is designed as the world's greatest, home concert hall. And the reason that we all go out and buy stereo equipment, and it doesn't quite sound like a concert hall, because basically we're in a room with an 8-foot ceiling. So what he did was build something that's called an infinite baffle. I mean, there's just an immense amount. This is like a concert hall stood on end, if you will. And behind all those screens up there are like 30 speakers, And there's an immense amount of volume behind those because those are acoustically porous, even though they're visually. And so you crank this thing up, you open these windows, and somebody on Long Island, 20 miles out there, you can blow them right out into the. And in fact, my poor mother, he had to line all the walls to your right in lead so that other people could exist in this house when he cranks up. So if you're ever in Stony Creek, go by. He loves to show this off, but take your earplugs with you because it'll be great. He's deaf now, and you will be too. But it is pretty amazing. And then there's a giant slab of granite down here. All these speakers are blast down into this couple tons of granite in the floor, that redistribute all this up. And it's the most amazing stereo experience you'll ever have in your life. And then, of course, he designed all these crazy lighting systems. So the lights are actually synced into the music. So you can have it cool up in the top or warm in the bottom, or you can do all these crazy things with it. Next slide. I mean, there it is, kind of at sunset. And those boats out there are hearing the music, like it's right in their hip pocket. Next slide. Again, here's the house in context, kind of this is the public facade. Funny stories about this. It took him 5 years to build this house. He and an old retired German carpenter friend of his built it. Then a bunch of architecture students every summer to kind of help him with it. And so, this old carpenter, he kind of took my working drawings and just threw them away. You don't know nothing, kid, about how to work with wood. So this house was put together in ways. I mean, we do some pretty expensive houses in the office, but there's details in this that nobody could afford because these guys weren't paying themselves. It was a hobby, right, for 5 years building this thing. And so, like that window, the ship's wheel window, has 250 different pieces of cedar. It took them 8 months to build that one rig. And each one's tongue, it's like a Chinese wood puzzle. Each one is kind of tongue grooved into the next one. And every one of the lights kind of articulate depending on the direction of the wind. You know, kind of pull wind into, they pull air into this thing. You know, I mean, what sane client would ever build anything like that? So, you know, we had a lot of fun kind of doing this thing. And you can see, you know, it's obviously in the tradition of the kind of stuff that I've learned from Bob over the years, where you do very big scale gestures, but they're very flat and subtle. In other words, you know, the kind of, of course the symbolism in this gesture was hilarious, because for years this took so long to build. Everybody around this area would come and, you know, down on Sunday and look and see what was happening. And the comments were great over the years. You know, the standard one was, when is the restaurant going to open, you know? And if they didn't ask that one, they wanted to know what denomination church it was. So I guess I had my symbolism a little wrong. And then, of course, my father has his big cranes and his marine railway and all this stuff that he likes to have. And so it's a combination of kind of, you know, that bungalow tradition, some of the Victorian tradition of this little community, and then with the help of Philip Johnson for all this granite, because this granite is all the faulted blocks that didn't go into the AT&T building. The quarry was open. This was done the year the AT&T was going up. They opened for the quarry for the first time in 40 years to give him the stone he wanted. And this is all the blocks that were faulted they didn't use, and we got for cheap just to take them away. So, and then some of the local Portuguese stonemasons kind of laid them all up dry. Next slide. It was a learning experience. Now on to Las Vegas. You know, when we went to Las Vegas, as I said, you know, it was to really learn some very practical skills that we thought were relevant for a certain kind of architecture. We waited years to do that architecture because they're not relevant to a lot of architecture. You know, they aren't relative to institutional architecture, which is mainly what we do. They're not relevant to, you know, most residential architecture. They're about the idea of representation and symbol and color and decoration. And that's, by and large, a commercial type thing. And so we waited years, and, you know, in this exhibit, this is one of kind of the first thing we did with those ideas that we looked at in the 60s and the 70s. We did this exhibition for the Smithsonian, of kind of collecting the golden oldies about the American commercial environment, putting it in the context of the museum, forcing people to see it at a different aesthetic distance than you see it on the road, to understand that there's good and bad in this stuff, just like there's good and bad architecture. Not all signs are bad, the way a lot of architects like to say. There are beautiful signs. There are bad signs. There's a right place to sign. There's a wrong place to sign. It's just, you know, common sense. It's saying, look, you know, that there are places, and the highway is one, and this country is still about highways, where this is relevant stuff. You can't do architecture out there without knowing how to do this. I mean, interestingly, of course, most of the objects in here were recreated for this, because this is the classic thing about this environment, of course, is that it constantly consumes itself. You know, the flying red horse is the flying red O, you know? I mean, it isn't the flying red horse anymore. So that idea of change and permanence became a really important thing. That there are different parts of the environment, some of which are fixed, like maybe City Hall, or relatively fixed. There's other parts, like gas stations, which every 10 years are going to be something totally different. And that idea of change, of pace being reflected rather directly in the larger environment, again, a key thing to understand, change and permanence. Next slide. The classic ideas, you know, the idea of vast space, because of the parking lot, and even though these buildings are kind of big in square footage, they're still relatively low given the scale of the highway and the parking lot, therefore the signs are big, because the architecture is relatively low and insignificant as space and as structure and as material. The idea of a one-point perspective of the highway, the whole thing of selective perception, that was another big idea, kind of eye-opener in a sense, in the same sense that the idea of symbols being much kind of overwhelming function and form sometimes, the idea that the eye of the observer can order the environment as much as what you draw on a piece of paper. In other words, we can all kind of clean this up and make all the signs 18 inches high and in Helvetica medium and in 3 colors, right? We can do that. And then we can look at this street, and in point of fact, you can't find what you're looking for because everything looks the same at 30 miles an hour when you do that. So what selective perception says, in a sense, if I'm hungry and driving down this boulevard, well, then I see max signs because that's what my eye is looking for. If I'm running out of gas, I see Gulf signs. So that while this is chaos, and it is, I mean, it probably is over the edge into, quote, visual chaos, it still works, and probably works better than most, quote, architect design order, because the competitiveness of this thing visually allows people within their own head to organize it on the basis of their needs, not on some assumed order that you're kind of applying to it. Now, obviously, there's a matter of degree. There's a point beyond which, that doesn't work on the side of chaos, and there's certainly a point on the side of order where it doesn't work too, because you can't distinguish things. But the kind of idea that there's a continuum that's much broader than the one that we certainly learned in the 60s in school about order, chaos, design, non-design, is much broader than the one we were taught, was 25 years ago a very liberating idea that you could, that you could really encompass these other things. Next slide. The classic thing at night, of course. And here, I mean, here's deconstruction. I mean, if this isn't deconstruction, I don't know what it is. I mean, this is the deconstructed environment. There's no foreground, there's no background, there's no space. I mean, you have no idea what, except for the guy who took this, what's in the foreground, what's in the background. The only way this reads is because you read English, you understand what some of these symbols mean, but the idea of the complex urban environment is the essence of deconstruction by its very nature. That it's this layering of all these things, highly competitive, contradictory, all happening at the same time. Now, the interesting thing, perhaps as a critique, as an aside about deconstruction in an individual building, is every piece of this is perfectly logical in its own terms. The overall effect is totally decon. The problem is, in other words, is maybe decon a much more relevant observation of the large-scale environment than it is an applicable idea to a building. Because every part of this is perfectly rational and kind of dumb and ordinary, whereas the totality is totally decon. So the idea that it's both and those things, that you can be decon on one scale and ordinary and representational on another scale, is perhaps the richer mix, at least from our point of view, of some of these ideas. Next slide. The classic building types, the decorated shed, the Stardust being the kind of greatest example of this. The idea of the building, it's because the front facade faces the road, that gets all the attention, that tells all the message, everything else is totally pedestrian behind it or whatever, ordinary. Again, change in permanence. This lasted for 10 years, it's now a mirror glass elevation, proving a good case arrives at Las Vegas eventually too. Next slide. The other, kind of classic thing, the duck, which was the kind of minority thing, of the idea of a building. The decorated shed is the kind of articulation of the front facade, which you see from the street. The duck is the building, which in order to get across the message, totally transforms the form sculpturally to get across the message. Now, it's a rather limited building type, right? Because there aren't many. You have to have a pretty simple function to put it into a hot dog or an ice cream cone or whatever it happens to be. And so it's one of these. And interestingly, this is one that people were really threatened by in the 60s. And still, there's a lot of fine arts commissions around that would absolutely freak out about one of these. It's so crazy though, because really, when you think about it, what's wrong with a little bit of humor in the environment? What's wrong with these things are self-limiting? They aren't going to happen on every block in America. I mean, and the idea that you can come down the street and see a certain juxtaposition of things or a certain object and kind of smile and say, gee, that's fun. Is that so bad? Is that so threatening? Are your values so insecure that you can't allow for this on one extreme? Is the point of these things. Not that we all should run out and design ducks. It's a much more general kind of attitude thing about a range of acceptable behavior that's maybe a little broader than we're taught in school sometimes. Next slide. Again, Las Vegas itself. This is Las Vegas at 15 years ago, the one that we looked at, basically the big signs, the little buildings, cars, no people. Gee, look what happened to Las Vegas. This is Las Vegas 6 months ago. Next slide. Wow. the strip is Main Street. You know, all the buildings have filled out to the street. It's now a totally pedestrian environment. And it takes it takes an hour to drive from one end to the other almost most of the time, you know. And so we're getting ready to go back and do a Las Vegas 25 years later studio this coming fall, because Las Vegas has become something totally different. The whole idea of edge city, to use the term that everybody's using now, is Las Vegas. You know, what does all that mean? How do you have to look at this different from the way we looked at it 25 years ago? It's going to be some interesting, hopefully it'll be as interesting as the first time, but it's going someplace else, I don't know where, totally different from the first time, because the thing has changed. It has transformed itself. Next slide. Here are some classic examples of Las Vegas then and now. Caesar's Palace. This is tasteful Las Vegas, in case you didn't know. Next slide. This is tasteless Las Vegas, in case you didn't know. This is the thing that is almost gone from Las Vegas. The kind of wacko, off-the-wall thing that some phrase Bob Stuckey, in this case. Stupak. Bob Stupak, sorry. Kind of, the idea, the astronauts stuck like a fly, squished on the wall. The moon rising over the casino, the umbilical cord, in neon. I mean, the giant erection, as you will, pulsating in night. I mean, this is totally off-the-wall stuff. And shitty building. I mean, you gotta see how awful this looks in the daytime. But anyhow, again, it isn't saying that everybody should run out and do this, or that every city needs one of these. They don't. But on the other hand, the idea that we ought to, in a pluralist society for sure, be able to allow this kind of off-the-wall stuff to happen is important, I think, or on the wall, as the case may be. Next slide. I mean, we haven't done much of this stuff. Here are just a couple examples that are pretty old now. Back in the 70s, we had a client come to us with Best Products and say, you got a store 200 feet on the side. It's got 3 doors, no windows. Make it look pretty. That was the program. I mean, the program was 1 paragraph. Having said that, it became a really complicated formal design problem, because we said, okay, this is an ugly box sitting in an ugly parking lot, and it's always going to be thus. And you can't change its dimension 1 inch anyway, because this is a machine for processing goods and people, and they're not going to let you change anything about this, except the skin. You got 1/8 of an inch or less to work with here. So this is the proverbial skin job. And so what we said was, well, what did we learn all those years ago in Las Vegas? Well, we learned that, a lot of things in highway architecture are ugly, but if you stick something on them that has associations that are not ugly, sometimes people are fooled or don't think it's quite so ugly. So everybody likes flowers, so we'll wrap this ugly box like a, like a present, if you will, in flowers, and it maybe be a slightly prettier box. Having said that, of course, we had to get tricky. We wanted a random sense of scale of this thing, almost like a piece of paper that's blown across the parking lot of the building. The process we were using was silk screening and porcelain enamel. It was highly repetitive, so we had to get very few colors and shapes that used the same screen. And so it took me months to develop. This would have been very easy in the era of CAD. This was pre-CAD, but to develop the randomness within a very ordered form. So as a formal exercise, it took hundreds of hours working this out. But as a kind of design statement, it was 3 sentences of what you had to do in the context you had to do it. Next slide. And I think it works in its own terms. The idea of this reflected in the cars reflected in it, the scale of something like this. In the terms, it's not saying that this is great architecture in any manner, shape, or form. It's saying that it's about as good as you can probably do in this context, in these limitations, and it's enough better that it's worth the effort from the standard. Next slide. Same year, we got a shot at doing another one of these things. And this was 2 in years and years and years. This was an existing 1950 shopping center, even worse. 1,100 feet long, 16 feet high, 1 door, no windows, 2 times, 3. Oh yeah. And the guy said, you got 3 months, another discounter basically, to make this look pretty for the Christmas selling season. And we said, Jesus, forget it. I mean, it's is a dog anyway you look at it. I don't care how great an architect you are, that's a dog. And so what we said, what did we learn in Las Vegas? Again, what we learned was when dealing with a dog, do something that's so big that you don't care about the dog, or just do a big dog, you know. And so in this case, obviously, it was to do an immense sign, so you didn't give a damn about what the building was behind it. And we said, oh, but hell, this is Philadelphia, not Las Vegas. We got a Fine Arts Commission. And we actually got this thing built. One, because there was the sign ordinance said that you could have a wall sign that has 5 square feet for every linear square foot of facade. That was a thing kind of set for downtown Philadelphia, Chestnut Street, you know, kind of 18th century street. But nobody had quite figured out about what would happen when, you know, you were out here and you had 1,100 feet times 5, 5,500 square feet. But they did add one little hook. They said you couldn't have any one sign bigger than 1,000 square feet. So we got into a fantastic, you know, kind of semiotic argument with the code people that the letter B was a sign unto itself, you know, semiotically speaking. And this went around for months, and finally they gave up, you know, just, oh, you know, all right, you can figure that every one of those is 1,000 square feet, build it. And then the Fine Arts Commission, basically, they could approve everything that was within 250 feet of the highway, and this was 275 feet back, and so we didn't have to go before them. And for years, they never forgave us. And so theoretically, we built the world's, according to Guinness, we built the world's second largest sign, the largest being the Hollywood Hills sign that we all know and love in Philadelphia. Next slide. And, you know, in its own terms, I think it's successful. Again, not saying this is great architecture. It really has very little to do with architecture. It has to do with what's appropriate and works in this environment. And I don't care whether you call that architecture or not. I mean, there aren't any old tacky sign or letter. You know, architects did it, obviously. They're cantilevered out of the ground. They're made out of quarter-inch aluminum plate. You know, I mean, they're just not, you know. I mean, they're obviously architects screwing around with this. The guy who did this, it was fascinating. He loved this thing. And he had, you know, the kids loved it for graffiti. You can see the graffiti paint out there. He'd sit here literally in his Cadillac Eldorado watching the sunset on this sucker. I mean, it made him. Next slide. Here's a very recent thing playing with some of the same ideas. An unsuccessful competition for the U.S. Pavilion and Expo over this summer and over in Barcelona. Again, kind of classic problem, temporary building, U.S. government so poor that, you know, they aren't even going to do the exhibits in it. They're going to rent out space to the corporations, you know. So they just wanted to build the dumbest thing, the programless, and still have an impact in one of these highly competitive fair environments, highly competitive environment. And so, next slide. What we came up with was literally kind of a shopping center convention hall solution. Slab on grade, big exhibit hall where you can rent space, a little Smithsonian museum, some VIP lounges, your kind of movie theater that you got to have in these things for the big screen movies, travel on. That's it. And rather than kind of queue everybody up, we're just going to let everybody enter every place. In this environment, you got to kind of cool this thing, but you can't afford the air conditioning. So we take the front facade and make the world's biggest swamp cooler. They're basically dripping water down through this truss, pulling air through it to try to, you know, kind of cool off the inner edge of this thing a little bit. And you take this big facade and you kind of cue everybody up to the movie inside the facade and they can look down. So that the process of waiting for the movie becomes part of the exhibit. It's a really ordinary, dumb, you know, kind of prefab steel structure. You put it on a boat and you erect it. And you tear it down and sell it off. The space frame's literally off the shelf. You know, it's a, and then it's, you know, our analysis is obviously this is a classic place for a decorated shed. It's got to be very direct and ordinary on one level, and we have nothing to do with what happens inside. On another level, you want to have some big visual impact. Next slide. And obviously, we were a little, if this competition had only been last year after Devon Storm, we would have won. Because, but, you know, the year before Devon Storm, everybody was really down on the flag, you know. I mean, it was like, the people in Washington, no, it was too showy, and, you know, you couldn't use the American flag. So we didn't do very good on this. But again, the idea of, you know, the space frame just had some fiberglass panels. They were all perforated, so you were kind of pulling the air through the perforations, the Venturi effect, as we all know and love. And then everybody's kind of entering underneath this thing. Next slide. Here you are in this view, queued up inside it, big swamp cooler behind it, and you're kind of flowing in underneath it. Next slide. Here you are up in the queue line, looking down into the exhibits below, kind of little travel logs to keep you occupied while your feet are up here. The ass end of the sign is kind of like all the countries of the world that have sent immigrants to the United States, so it's just all letters and words. Next slide. Here you are coming out of the movie theater, looking down Main Street. Next slide. Here's just the kind of model, the fragment of how this whole thing, again, the kind of perforated standard, fiberglass panel, the off-the-shelf space frame, and then just kind of a simple steel structure, steel frame structure with all these kind of louvers and stuff and a lot of fans hauling air through it. Next slide. Here's one of the few ducks we ever did. This was a 2-week-long project for Philip Johnson. He has been for the last 15 years designing these big towers on Times Square. This was in their POMO days, now they're Decon. This was pre that. At any rate, he kind of moves with the way things go. He came to us and he said, look, I'm getting shitted on by the AIA of New York because they tell me I'm tearing down all those wonderful, funky Times Square signs. Those guys wouldn't have known that those were neat signs unless you hadn't written that dumb book. And so I'll pay you 10 grand for 2 weeks to come up with an idea that on Times Square that'll get them off my back because, if you guys do it, they can't complain. That makes it funky again. And so we knew it was a setup and, it was we were really being set up. But anyhow, we figured, what the hell, it's 2 weeks and a little bit of money and we'll have some fun with it. And we kind of sat there for about 8 days and came up with giant signs and giant fountains and giant flags, and none of them worked. His building was so awful, it was just hopeless. Nothing worked. Nothing could compete with the awfulness of his architecture. And finally, in desperation, literally with a couple days to go before we had to present this, at lunch, we're sitting around the table and this model's in the middle of the table and somebody says, what would Klaus Oldenburg do in this situation? And somebody took their apple out and put it in the middle of the model. And we said, yeah, that's it. And that was, one that tells you something about how you get ideas sometimes. That happens more often than you think, for all of us, when you're lucky. But it's a very real thing. What does Oldenburg teach you about complex urban environments? What his pieces at their best teach you is that there are all kinds of irremediably awful situations, this being one, in a lot of environments. What he does so brilliantly is come along by putting the right representational symbolic object with a little bit of formal spin on it in that thing. It doesn't have to be the biggest thing in this environment because the symbol is so powerful, you don't see anything else except that. That's the power of Oldenburg sculpture when it's really great. It just so dominates because of the power of the symbol that you can dominate buildings that are much bigger, and that's the situation here. So the Big Apple on Times Square, obviously we're architects, not sculptors, so we had to make it he was, that was it. It lasted about 2 days. It's one of the best things we ever did. I've shown this all over the world. Everybody gets it instantaneously, but, it'll never happen. Next slide. We have done a few great kind of urban monuments, though. This is one we just finished 3 years ago. It's hard to show in a static photograph because this is all animation. And it was a competition we won for relighting the Benjamin Franklin Bridge as part of the celebration of the 200th anniversary of the Constitution. And again, this is Las Vegas 20-some years later, and it has nothing to do with Las Vegas. This is kind of a great symbol gateway to Philadelphia and Camden, New Jersey. And what we did, though, we learned from Las Vegas in the sense that you The difficulty of this was one, a lot of practical problems, and two, a really difficult formal problem. If you light buildings, you've got surface, right? And you see the light because it hits something. A suspension bridge, by its very essence, is mainly space. There's all very little actual surface, and that's the elegance of it, right? This minimalist surface. So how in the hell do you light something that's got no surface? It's like, and what you learn from Las Vegas is if you don't have a lot of surface and the light moves, your eye sees movement. And the classic example of that is when they have a used car lot opening and they get some old surplus searchlights. And those lights kind of go across the night sky. As long as they're moving, you see them, boy, from miles. The minute you shine that light straight up into the air, though, invisible. Your eye could not see it because there's nothing there except a little bit of pollution in the air for that light to actually hit. So it's the movement of light that can be very powerful in a nighttime environment. So what we did here was say, okay, and then all the lights had to be right down here. Couldn't put any lights up in the structure because they didn't want to change light bulbs by sending nice steel workers up in this thing. So every light had to be right here where somebody could walk along and put a standard street light in. So basically, and then my father basically designed this thing after we came up with the idea. It's again, one of these things that formally is very simple. The engineering of it is immensely complex. It's 600 very narrow beam spotlights. The longer cables get 4 lights, the little cables get 1 light, all the same light, shining up the hanger cables and hitting with a target being the catenary. So all the lights down here, and it's the same light you use in a street light, so it's dead simple. You're only stocking 1 light. And then when a train goes across every 10 minutes, it triggers a computer-driven sequence where this thing starts to animate, first at about 4 miles an hour, rippling from shore to shore, and after about 3 minutes, 400 miles an hour. So the thing's just zooming back and forth, and this happens about every 10 minutes. Just this, for New Year's, we finally got the computer program in for doing music animation. And now, at New Year's, they had a chorus down here, and the bridge kind of frequency sensitive to the music, kind of following like the bouncing ball. That's a simple idea again, but the complexity of it was that you had to do it with a metal halide discharge tube. Incandescent tubes you can make go on and off, but a discharge tube, like a street light, it takes about 5 minutes until the voltage gets up and the thing comes on. So we had to evolve kind of it's now patented, a really tricky circuit that basically underdrives a standard discharge tube to just above its firing potential and then overdrives it for a couple microseconds over 150%. And your eye perceives that as an on and off pulse when in fact the light never goes off. And so it doesn't change the lifespan of the light, and all of this, thanks to your little PC computer, allows you to sit there and kind of paint and play with this grid. Now they're going to hire a bunch of conceptual artists, now that we've got the final software into this thing 4 years later, to kind of play with this thing in the summer and kind of make different effects. So again, it shows you something you learned here from a totally different environment that gave you the tools to deal with the problem in a very different situation. This is probably one of the most successful things we ever did in a popular sense. Within a month of it being finished, it was on the cover of the phone book and on the sign-off. It still is for 2 out of 4 TV stations in the city. If that isn't a vote that you hit the right thing the right way, I don't know what is. Next slide. Now we're looking at augmenting it for 92. Here's the bridge over here with an immense watercolor projections and along the 2 shorelines using some of the same ideas plus lasers to have, kind of a 5-mile long lighting thing for 1992. Next slide. Here's another monument we're working on right on that same shoreline for 92. This is a monument for Christopher Columbus being built by the Italian-American community in Philadelphia. The idea was obviously to use an obelisk because of all the Italian associations of public symbol of that form. On the other hand, we weren't going to build a solid human obelisk out on the shore. What this obelisk becomes is kind of a deconstructed, if you will, obelisk. Inside here is a triangle of structure with then another rotated triangle on it, basically. This is all stainless steel. And so during the day, as you can see here, it basically reads as kind of dark joints with a stainless steel form, and then all your writing at the bottom. During the night, next slide, the whole thing reverses itself, and you blast light up through it, so it becomes a great lightsaber. And light leaks out of all this thing, and it now becomes the reverse of what it does during the day. And it really just becomes a big lit pylon along the shore. Obviously, light's going to kind of blast up through the top of this thing. Next slide. Here is, real quickly, we're kind of running out of time here, a bunch of things that we did for Disney over the years that never got built. We had this love-hate thing with Disney. They come to us, we come up with some ideas, they last about 6 weeks and we quit. And they keep coming and we keep quitting. But this was a number of years ago when when Michael Eisner took over Disney and started doing all the Graves and Stern stuff. And Disney has a classic problem that they're moving out of the kind of theme park into much more traditional commercial architecture and other types of elements. And so the basic problem is, how do they compete with themselves by using the kind of representation and symbolism of the park, or do you come up with some more abstract way of another language for them to use in a more ordinary environment? And so this was using words to try to make them see what the kind of problem they had is in terms of design these kind of commercial buildings like Graves' hotels, et cetera, et cetera. Next slide. And one thing we worked on was, this is the Dolphin and Swan Hotel. Here's Epcot. And they wanted a connection for jitneys and an adult entertainment area. This is the Stern Hotel with public amusement. That for grown-ups to do something at night, basically. And so we said, all right, the classic way to do this would be to do a boardwalk. It's very incremental. You can add to it over time. It's a good linear way to connect one thing to another for pedestrians and whatnot. In the Disney mythology, though, it was a no-no because a boardwalk has an ass end, right? That looks like an ass end, and it has a front facade. In Disney's kind of wonderful perverted logic, you never have ass ends. You spend millions of dollars to make believe that that there's no trash in the world, and nothing bad ever happened. And so right off, this is a bit of a problem. But the problem is, of course, when you do what Disney does, things cost $5,000 a square foot. Disney, this is an eye-opener, the typical Disney theme park piece of architecture is the most expensive thing next to a missile silo built in the last 50 years. Typical ride, $5,000 a square foot to build a ride. To give you an idea, the National Gallery or the National, the fanciest art museum, the Getty Museum by Richard Meyer or something, probably is what, $350 a square foot. That gives you an idea of the way these guys spend money. Now, on the other hand, if you're building a restaurant and it costs $5,000 a square foot, even if you're Disney, you're crazy, right? I mean, you're really, so their problem was, how do you get these guys to admit to commercial reality when they deal in a world where you can amortize $5,000 a square feet in 6 months because of this immense money machine? I mean, it's just insane. Next slide. And so what we did was say, okay, get the Imagineers to do the wacky, billboards, kind of boardwalk architecture. And then, since you don't want to see any of this from the Tony hotels during the day, we'll erect a kind of artificial set of trees on a space frame with a little canopy so you can get out of the sun and the rain walking along here. And what you'll see during the day from across the lagoon is these silhouettes of trees. Next slide. So during the day, here we are. We have our trees. We have our kind of funky Atlantic City behind. We get a big boardwalk hotel. Next slide. And then at night, we use the technology from the bridge for the trees all ripple and all the neon starts to come through the holes in the trees from behind. So you kind of have your cake and eat it too. Needless to say, it didn't happen. I think Bob Stern's doing a Georgian boardwalk. Next slide. We also did the same year, looked at Euro Disney. They threw together, all the famous architects. Boy, somebody ought to have a videotape going on this sucker. It was for 4 days over Easter Sunday. They had a squat with Graves and Stern and Bob and Fury, redesigning Euro Disney in a 3-day weekend. After they'd spent millions in a couple of years' work. And it was so awful, we said, look, we're not interested. We'll look at some of your symbolic problems. Because architecturally, this is a nightmare. And so we kind of concentrated on the idea of what do you do in the wintertime environment of France. And, most of the other Disneylands are in bright, benign environments, and you use the landscape as what knits these things together, the lush landscape. So what do you do when everything's brown and dark and duffy 6 months of the year, as it would be in France? And so they had this grand alley, and this was one of our first attempts at kind of computer animation and simulation that led into this thing. You came kind of 4 miles of the magic kingdom down at the end of it. And we said, well, what you do is you create a series of kind of beautifully lit trees, artificial trees, and great signs of all the great mythic figures, because Disney's the only thing next to the Catholic Church that has a worldwide symbolism that everybody understands. And so, what the hell, you guys? And here you are in Europe, where most of the kind of fake European imagery of Disneyland is going to look, maybe a little funny. So maybe you ought to fall back on, the other set of symbols that you're known by. Michael Izenour was crazy enough to almost do this, but the people that surround him, it scared the shit out of them, and it didn't happen. Next slide. They also asked us to do a Las Vegas hotel because they were doing a whole series of hotels in Euro Disney, and Graves was doing a New York hotel, and Fredoc was doing an Adobe thing, and everybody was doing these kind of thematic American hotels. And Eisner went to Las Vegas for something, and he came to one of these meetings and said, I saw Las Vegas, we really look pretty neat, wow. And we said, yeah, somebody said that once. He was totally blank. He says, we couldn't do anything like this in the United States because it's fuzzy, and we're pure. But, in Europe, who's going to know the difference, so why don't we do a Las Vegas hotel? So what we did was kind of work on a hotel that took the idea of the old Stardust sign and made it three-dimensional. The sign becomes the lobby. You literally walk into this thing. It's a three-dimensional sign. Behind it is a rather conventional, hotel. So again, classic decorated shed. You put all the pizzazz in the front of this thing for day and night, and behind it is a fairly conventional building. It didn't get built as much as anything because of our way of. We did 3 versions of this in about 2 months, and the first 2 were awful. It was just terrible. And so we'd go into these presentations with all these architects sitting there, and Eisner and all these Disney little Indians sitting there. And Bob would get up in front of these drawings and say, I really hate this. This is shitty. We really didn't do very good. And they'd all look like, that isn't the way you talk in Hollywood. They take you at your word. And he'd start redrawing it right in front of it, and all the architects would, oh my God, what's this crazy guy doing? And so by the time we finally got one which was good, which was this one, they totally believed us and thought it was awful. And we couldn't convince them otherwise. Next slide. So it never happened. Now let's quickly look at what we're doing down in Columbus. This is some work that we did, just a little sample of some of the work we did last September with Cato and people from here helping. It was the kind of way, and a lot of this is kind of Denise's way of getting into a problem like this. Our goal is to kind of redesign this gateway off of the I-65 exit into Columbus. Here they're doing a new Emilio Ambas kind of funkadelic bridge that will be the new gateway into the grid of the old city. This thing's all complicated by the fact that there's an immense floodplain that basically, on one hand, kind of protects this road. You get your kind of commercial stuff here, standard gas stations, Holiday Inn. This intersection is like 10,000 other intersections of interstates in America. But obviously you can't build here because this is a floodplain. So you kind of have this kind of rather pristine agricultural piece of road coming into the city. And so in some ways it's kind of classic interchange strip versus a kind of blank road now, and then a rather tony, high-design bridge at one end. Next slide. And so in this squat, we kind of, did a lot of other very quick drawings in a few days, kind of looking at themes and ideas. This was kind of one that, showed how the commercial growth was going to happen in a very limited area. Kind of showed this agricultural and golf course or park this link, and then bang it to town. Next slide. The first idea of image for this thing, and this is, was literally done in one night, as Cato can attest to, was the idea of making this thing kind of a parkway. It's raised because of the floodplain, doing some kind of symbolic light fixture. Being Easterners, we immediately hooked on the corn, right? That lasted about one day, and Columbus said, we got too much corn, and we're much too sophisticated to have corn, so that died real quick. But again, the basic idea of kind of a fairly simple parkway with some symbolic object that was going to kind of make this thing work was the key to it. Next slide. And so for the last few months, we've kind of, they haven't seen this yet. This is even just finished this weekend. And just hopefully arrived by Federal Express this morning in Columbus. And this is kind of, again, just in terms of drawing technique, this is kind of a daytime photograph that we've kind of knocked down to nighttime with the airbrush. And then with cut paper going back in and began to add the quote design elements. The problem with something like this, that is, you are in this highly competitive commercial environment. That's not going to go away. Those guys need to sell. This is an important part of the economy, is this interchange. And so, it's kind of, in our terms, irrelevant to go and, quote, clean that stuff up beyond a certain point. It is what it is. So what we're saying is, okay, we need some kind of entry symbol that lets you know that Columbus is down the road 3 miles. So maybe we'll take a traditional idea of kind of gateways that a lot of Middle Western towns used to have. We'll combine that with kind of the standard interstate highway structure, but we'll do it at a scale and in color that'll make you, think that it's very special. It will also create a crosswalk between the Holiday Inn and the Ramada so that people can get across this busy thoroughfare without getting killed. And then we'll take the standard lighting element of this thing that happens on any highway like this, and we'll make that special somehow. And the way of doing that we kind of think that we're starting to do, kind of test this out. It's a very subtle idea, and whether it'll actually stand up in the real environment remains to be seen. But you take the standard tapered light pole, you take the technology of the bridge lighting thing, the narrow beam spotlight that sits right on top of that light pole and blasts light down it, so it becomes a lit line of color. And then you create a kind of oscillating rainbow when you see this thing in perspective. Because even though the light pole is small, when you see them in perspective, they all line up. And so you get this rippling thing of color carrying you right down into the city. Next slide. Here's under the sign and the crosswalk looking towards the Ramada. What we're saying to the owner of the Ramada is, you've got this wonderful 1950s motel. Don't screw it up, man, because this thing's going to be an heirloom. So we'll put the neon back into it. You got the big McDonald's hyperbolic paraboloid. I mean, don't put a mansard on it. Please, please don't. Because this is due to come back real soon. And here you are under the big structure of the crosswalk. Again, this is airbrush and cut paper. Real quick technique for this type of thing. The big poles. You can do a whole rendering like this in about half a day. Next slide. Here's a kind of cut paper representation of the big sign during the day, the pole, big letters, big porcelain letters on the kind of traditional interstate sign. So you've taken a standard thing and you just up the scale to make it special, and use the typeface, obviously, to make it, kind of civic. Next slide. A little bit of postcard. Here we are at the golf course agricultural area, the kind of landscape medium. During the day, the poles kind of separating, up close, but in perspective, becoming this, rippling line of color, taking you down into the city. Next slide. Same thing at night. The color temperature of the pole being very cool, the street lighting being very warm, so that the two kind of contrast and play off of each other. So again, this is a very dumb idea, right? Really simple. You've taken the standard element and you just put that 10% spin on it. It makes you see it very differently. That's probably the best way, we think, to deal with these kind of environments. Because the big design object stretched over 3 miles, can be pretty silly, whether it's a corn cob. 300 corn cobs is maybe, as a symbol, doesn't hold up. You get tired of it. Something like this, though, is abstract and pretty enough, quote unquote, that it just might work over time. Next slide. Maybe, let's see, what are we talking about? I guess we better stop pretty soon. I'll just show, I've got a lot more, but I think we're going to have to cut this off since I have to drive this longer. And I'll come back in a month or two and maybe we can finish phase 2 or something. This is what we really do. Most of the stuff I've been showing you is the fun stuff, the things that we do 10% of the time. As a firm, we do institutional architecture for institutions like this, museums and universities. That's what we do. And so a lot of those ideas that we have fun with are really not necessarily applicable here. I mean, here's a kind of classic university decorated shed. These are the Cadillacs of the university world. High-tech molecular biology buildings. Every big university's got to have one of these suckers. They cost $300 a square foot. I mean, they are the creme de la creme. You get your Nobel Prize with this sucker. And so they are our bread and butter. We're on our 5th one of these things. There's a big firm in Boston that does the interiors. They're totally, engineered to the last inch from the inside out. This is functionalism the way we were taught in school. The building is absolutely a result of the laboratory and the mechanical system. That's all mechanical. 60% of the money in these things is nothing but mechanical equipment. The architecture is 6 inches thick on the outside of these things. A lot of the universities we work for say, we want the most high-tech, super colossal whiz-bang, and then we can steal faculty from go over there. But we want it to look real traditional as part of our old campus. So that's where we come in. We do the skin on these things. We put the skin on the bologna. And what they become is a kind of updating of a classic New England loft mill building. I mean, the idea that these things are unbelievably repetitive. So it's the elements we work with are the proportion of the window, the pattern of the material. That's it. That's the very limited vocabulary. In this case, we even got a touch of Las Vegas because this building, you only see the top of this building from the expressway a mile and a half out as you come in from the airport. Almost nobody, I mean, this photograph is totally unreal in the sense that the photographer is standing someplace where almost nobody can see the building. So you're down in here, you never see that. But when you're on the expressway coming towards the university, you get the Big Ten insignia kind of zapping out at you in porcelain off the mechanical equipment here. But this is basically our kind of bread and butter architecture. I mean, it's a very limited vocabulary, very subtle play of kind of proportion and rhythm, and very two-dimensional. Next slide. Because it doesn't get in the way. That's versus the kind of way of using all that mechanical equipment is expressive. The trouble with that is that the damn mechanical equipment changes every 18 months. So if you make architecture out of it, you got to tear the building apart. So doing it as a skin job is the rational way to do those buildings because the mechanical equipment is constantly changing behind the skin. Now here's another kind of institutional work we do that Marvin will enjoy. This is one of the greatest pieces of 19th century architecture that Penn almost tore down when we were students because it was so out of pace with modernism that the architectural faculty voted by one vote to save this in 1964. 5 years ago, we got the job to kind of renovate and restore this. And this is us, again, acting totally faceless. I mean, this is Frank Furness, one of the greatest 19th century architects in America. It has nothing to do with us, except our appreciation of Frank Furness and trying to put it back together again. This is one of the great monuments of 19th century architecture. Next slide. We worked 6 years to kind of restore it. Next slide. We'll just fly through these. This is kind of our architecture appreciation. Just enjoy it. Just go as fast as you can. Details out of this wonderful plan. Next slide. This is the entry hall. Next slide. This is the great reading room. Stop a second. When we were students in the 20s, they just showing that we aren't the only tasteless people in the 20th century. In the 1920s, they put a floor in the middle of this space and cut it in half to get more stack space. And so what we did was tear all that out and open the great reading room. This is one of the great 19th century spaces in America. I mean, just the way light streams in. gymnasium. This building was open for 1 week after it opened. You can't get a seat in this reading room after 10 in the morning. Every student in this university votes with their feet. I mean, the modern library would be empty if they could all fit in here. I mean, they just love this room. You literally can't get a desk from 10 in the morning to 10 at night because of the, you know, the quality of space and light, just the experience of being in this thing. Next slide. Details. Again, you know, the only thing that it does here is, you know, putting a chair, choosing a fabric, designing a light fixture. I mean, it's you know, you're working within totally to restore somebody else's, you know, great architectural vision. Next slide. The apps at the end of the reading. Next slide. The great stair. This is where Bob Venturi got the idea for the stair to nowhere in his mother's house. The stair literally goes up to nowhere. It just ends in kind of a window at the top. This is Louis Kahn's. There was actually even an imminence of, there was a crazy guy, actually one of Louis Kahn's crazier employees, who lived up at the top of that stair for a number of years, and picked up co-eds in the studio in the middle of the night. We had to throw him out when we did the renovation. And this was Louis Kahn's great studio space that, because he would never set foot in the other buildings. The architecture school. Next slide. And this is Louis Kahn's studio, the great map studio at the top of the building. Next slide. I think we ought to just stop there, maybe. That's a good 5 point. Oh, just go to the last 4 slides in the box. Let's just end with a, since this one's upside down. Whoops, that one is flip it over. So I just, and I will come back again since I'll be coming back to Columbus and do all the art museums and stuff that we are doing tonight, so there's a just come on for another chance to see more stuff, particularly the Seattle Art Museum, which we're just finishing right now as I speak. We'll have pictures of in another 6 weeks. So I leave you again with this idea, you know, of that you really can, you learn about architecture from, you know, great architecture and great architects, obviously, but you also learn about it. You can change the world, one, by what you draw and what you build, but also by the way you see things differently. I mean, there's lots of times where the kind of responsible design response is to see something and say it is fine the way it is. That is to see it, in other words, to interpret what you see in a way that preserves it and says this is beautiful in its own terms, and it should be left. And that, so that, you know, the kind of, it seems negative, but you don't have to actually design and build all the time. You can change the world by learning to see it differently as well as designing it differently. And that's what the exercise of, you know, the ordinary and these little buildings is all about. Next slide. And you can also, you know, learn to understand from something that is awful, quote unquote, that is bad, quote unquote. And the way you find those things is anything that your design teachers tell you is really great or really awful, check it out, right? I mean, you always check out the really great, but you check out the really awful because, you know, again, these were all the things that I was taught as a student, you know, were terrible and, you know, would corrupt us beyond belief. In point of fact, they didn't, I don't think. And there was something interesting and something to be learned from. So, you know, check it out when somebody tells you something. Somebody feels strongly about something to say it's awful. There's probably something there that's worth looking at. Next slide. And that goes for, you know, the complexity of something that, you know, our kind of architects have a tendency to oversimplify things. They have a tendency to learn one thing and apply it every place. What looking at something like the American Main Street teaches you is that, you know, that you don't necessarily get rid of all the cars, that you can have people, you can have cars, you can have one era as sign and facade and another era as building, and that wonderful kind of ad hoc complexity of all that is, as Bob said 25 years ago, almost all right. And that, again, is this idea that learning to see is what is there is as important as changing it. Sometimes it's more important. Last slide. So finally, you know, this is always our last slide. Thomas Cole's The Architect's Wet Dream. And again, the message is that, you know, we can learn to do all this stuff, and that's what you're here to do, you know, to learn the vocabularies, to learn to acquire the skill. But if you don't apply the skill with a little bit of common sense, it's crazy. And so, you know, you got to learn how to do it, but even more important, you got to know where to do it, when to do it, as well as how to do it. Thank you.
For your $20, do they get to ask any questions? Anybody have any questions, or you want to wait till we spend another $20 to see if we get Steve to come back? Okay, we'll try to go for the other $20. So I know you're tired, and I really appreciate the time you spent. Hope we can get you to come back soon and show us the rest of your slides. And he'll be out in the hall taking orders for projectors. Anybody has a cash-only deal. Thanks again very much.